Hi, it's Pastor Andy with Monday's discipleship video, and this week and next we're going to look at the vision that Ezekiel had of the new temple, and we find this in Ezekiel chapter 40 through 48. And this is a fascinating passage, but it's very difficult to interpret. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to kind of lay out the general vision, just the general idea, and then talk about why it's important this week. And then next week, I'm going to look at 5 different ways that we could interpret this, all of which have some viability to them, some more than others, but it's just a very difficult passage. And, you know, there are certain things in the Bible that are difficult to explain. The deity of Jesus and the divinity of Jesus. He was 100% God, 100% man. And when I was in elementary school, I learned that 100 plus 100 equals 200. And that 50 plus 50 equals 100. But Jesus is completely God and completely man. That doesn't make sense to my mind, but I can believe it. I can believe that there can be 3 in one, called the Trinity, even though that doesn't make sense to me at all. My mind is too limited to understand that, but I can believe it. So there are theological constructs, but there are some passages that are very difficult to understand as well. And Ezekiel 40 through 48 is one such passage. And part of the challenge is we're trying to take an Old Testament idea and trying to understand it within the construct of the New Testament, or even now, we're still in New Testament times, but beyond what the New Testament would be. Now, it's interesting that Ezekiel ends with this fascinating vision of the temple. 9 chapters. In the first chapter, we had a different type of fascinating vision, and that was of God on His throne in heaven with the 4 creatures around Him and the eyes and all of that. It's just a fascinating thing. That is difficult enough to understand. But so Ezekiel started with this fascinating vision. It ends with a different type of fascinating vision, and But this one has a different set of challenges in interpretation. Now, there are a lot of parallels here that can be made to different things in history. And for instance, there is a seer that lived about 1,500 years prior to Ezekiel, named Gudea, that had a similar type of vision of a temple at one point in time for that deity, for his deity. Not for Yahweh, not for God, the God that we worship, but there's a similar type of vision. And we find that throughout Scripture. There are things that are in the Hebrew Bible that have corresponding stories and things like that. Moses' story, there was a story very similar to Moses that happened about 2,000 years before Moses. Jesus' birth, there are stories that happen hundreds of years that are similar to Jesus' birth. But we can look at this story seeing that God can still use those same types of things for His people in a very, very specific way. And so whether or not this passage was to be understood by the people to be fulfilled in their time frame. Remember, Ezekiel is in Babylon. He is in exile, writing to people who are in exile or who are going to be in exile. Were they seeing this new temple as the temple that would be built about 60 to 80 years later? Or something that would be built or expanded upon during Jesus' time? Or is this, again, something that is still to come? So let me give you a quick context for this. Again, Ezekiel's in Babylon. Judah, he's already talked about the fact that Judah's going to fall, that Jerusalem's going to fall. Jeremiah picks up on that, obviously, and writes about that extensively. But approximately 20 years have passed since Ezekiel first started writing, since his first vision. So there's been about 20 years that have passed, and the situation has not improved at all. Probably it is even more severe at this point in time, in part because Jerusalem had fallen, and when Jerusalem fell, the original temple was destroyed. Therefore, the people of Judah in the southern kingdom of Israel, what had been united Israel, but now the kingdom of Judah, they had been taken captive. They had been brought, many of them had been brought to Babylon as well, and they were now in exile. So Ezekiel has lived in captivity for at least 2 decades. Maybe he was there prior. We don't know for sure. So hope was faint. But hope was desperately needed. And if you can think back to the time of Moses, when the tabernacle was constructed, and then in the time of David, and then Solomon, and ultimately Solomon, when the temple was constructed, the idea of a place where God dwelled brought immense hope to the people. Even the carrying of the Ark of the Covenant brought immense hope to the people. And so with the people of Judah knowing that Jerusalem had been destroyed, that the temple had been destroyed, and hearing a vision, hearing that God was speaking through this prophet, that there would be a restoration of the temple, had to be something significant for them to give them some hope, this hope of a restored temple. So the question would be would they, Judah for instance, embrace the plans now that they have been forced to live away from their land, from their temple for so many years? So it was at this point that in the vision, Ezekiel was brought to the city. And the inference here, this is interesting, the inference here is that the city would be Jerusalem, but Jerusalem is not named in this passage. It does say that it was God brought me to the land of Israel. However, Ezekiel never says Jerusalem throughout these chapters. And again, if we go back to Ezekiel 16, Jerusalem has been destroyed at that point. So there could be something to that. But the hearers of the prophecy, the ones who were there in that day, when they heard that God took him to the city, when they heard about a temple, there would have been no doubt in their mind that Jerusalem would have been the place that Ezekiel was referencing. It would be the place for the new temple. It would be the only conceivable place for the new temple in their minds. And so Ezekiel's vision would begin to stir their hearts to when the first exiles would begin to return home more than a generation, maybe 2 generations later, and begin to allow them to think about what the possibilities were to come. That indeed, God was not done with his people. It was just going to be a matter of time before they could begin to restore what they had lost. But God still had a plan for them. And he still has a plan for us as well.